Geeks and geekettes, ladies and gentlemen, comic book fans all around the world, my dominant heron, senors and senoritas, gats and gittens. Welcome to another massive information dump based on your intriguing queries. Some engaging questions this week. I'm going to go deep on a few of these subjects, I guess. I don't write this stuff down. It's on the fly. So let's not waste another second of your precious time. Ace Mowick, what do you think were some advantages that pulp writers had over the decades of writers that have come since, especially within the last 30 years? Well, the biggest thing that pulp writers had going for them in the 30s, 40s, and 50s, and let's face it, even up into the 70s with men's adventure books and, bodice ripping romance stuff. That's all pulp. The advantage they had was an open market. I mean, if you were even slightly skilled at writing and could meet a deadline, and could push out 2,000 to 5,000 words a day, you could make a good living, working for, 2 cents, 3 cents a word in the pulps. I think that was the scale. So if you could pump out a novel a month, you were doing okay. Later on, with the paperback boom of the 50s, the pulp writing continues, and there are advances. I think, in the 70s, you could get a $2,500 advance to write a novel, and you could do all right. You could do all right, but you had to work for it, and there were no residuals generally in the paperback market. If you hit a certain number, you'd get some money back in royalties, but those were few and far between. These things were usually, marginally profitable. The publishers made money in the aggregate. In other words, the publishers of pulps and paperbacks made money largely on most the lower level houses made money off of the number of books they were selling, not counting on one book to be a big bestseller, but 100 books doing okay, and that brought in money. And that's basically how the ebook publishers work today. They work in the aggregate. They have books that sell 10 copies a month. They have books that sell 100 copies a month. But if you've got thousands of books doing that, you're going to make some cash, sort of skim it off the top. And, advantages for pulp writers, that was the biggest one. That, there was a desire, like an explosion in people wanting content. And pulps served, niche readerships, and there were pulps about railroads. I mean, there were pulps about just anything you could possibly imagine. And they, if you were reliable, you had gainful employment. But, it wasn't a whole lot of back end. So that's the advantage they have over today's writers, where not as many people are reading. There's stiff competition in the ebook market. Ebook market is so crowded, it's insane. It is hard to get noticed at all in ebook and print on demand, because there, and even more so now because there's so much AI slop out there. Just thousands of new books being published every day. And as I said in previous videos, eventually, Amazon in particular is going to have to go in and clean this up, because they're not making any money in the aggregate off of these books that are basically filling up their servers with AI, junk. But the other advantage that pulp writers had was that at least their editors and publishers understood their audience, weren't trying to restrict their audience. If you wrote something and it was successful, they asked you to write more. And also, everybody was welcome. Men, women. There were women. There were a lot of women writing pulps, a lot of times under male pseudonyms, because Pulps were largely a male thing. Men read these things. Women read the slick magazines, or confession magazines, things like that. And in that area, a lot of those writers were women. So it was wide open. Today, it's not. If you're a male writer, you're going to have a hard time because the publishers are female dominated. I mean, I'm talking about the big publishing houses are female dominated, and they only want female oriented fiction. If you've been to a Target or a Barnes and Noble recently and seen the walls of pastel colored covers with women's names on them and hardly a man in sight, you understand that the publishing over the years, I've discussed this in previous videos, over the years, the New York publishing houses, which are the publishing houses here in the United States, that's the big market, that's the big show. Those publishing houses have shrunk their area of interest down and down and down. They've shrunk their target audience down to, metrosexuals who live south of 14th Street in Manhattan, and elementary school teachers who have too many cats. So, they sort of shrunk that more, and they've been doing this for a long time. First shrinking down to only the interest of people in the Northeast, literati and pseudo-intellectuals and subliterates, shrinking down so, they didn't want stories about anything other than, neurotic advertising executives. And then it shrunk down further and further and further. And that wasn't true of the pulps. The pulps were redundant publishing. If it sold, they wanted more. Whatever you were writing about. If you're writing about World War I aces, or sword swinging barbarians, or masked Avengers, if the audience bought it, the publisher said, "Hey, they like this crap. Give them some more." But today, the audience doesn't determine, or it hasn't determined for decades, what gets published. And today, the audience is irrelevant, and the audience is shrunken. People don't. People say, "Well, why don't people read more books?" Well, why don't you publish more books people want to read? You've abandoned a large part of the audience. And that's something the pulps never did. So, why did the pulps go away is another question. I think the pulps went away like so many things. World War II, things changed. And the audience for the pulps, went to war and it kind of outgrew them. Also, World War II sees the advent of the paperback, where publishers, basically the government was printing these cheap paperback books that could be given out to the troops. And the troops got used to reading them. And so when they came home from war, the publishers said, we published millions of copies of these cheap paperback mysteries and westerns. And the GIs ate them up. And the feedback we're getting is they love them. So why don't we offer them to the general public? And that was the paperback boom of the 50s, which was enormous. It was just a phenomenon. The explosion in publishing in post-World War II, which all the way into the 70s when and then the paperback market begins to crap out a bit in the early 80s. Anyway, a lot more than you asked, but hey, it's my show. And I said it was going to be an information dump. Next question. Chuck Johnson. During your Green Arrow run, you had several crossovers with Green Lantern. He came up with the crossovers. You, Ron Mars, or the editors. How did you plot them out? It was kind of we had Green Lantern and Green Arrow meet because that was the tradition. DC had sort of a warm, fuzzy feelings about the Green Arrow, Green Lantern run back in the 70s by Denny O'Neil and Neil Adams, which, as I've also discussed before, was commercially a huge failure. Although some of that's been called into question recently with some iffy, kind of corrupt, behind-the-scenes shenanigans with news agents and distribution. But anyway, in any case, the people at DC have a lot of nostalgia for these books. And so, they wanted Green Arrow and Green Lantern to meet occasionally, which we did. So we had Kyle Rayner, the new Green Lantern, and Connor Hawke, the new Green Arrow. Mix it up a bit in I think 3 different arcs when I was on the books. And it was Ron Mars every time. And I had known Ron for years. And basically they would, Ron would come down from, wherever he was living. I think he was up in Woodstock. I'd come up from Pennsylvania. And we'd have a meeting, a day-long meeting about what we wanted to do. And generally, I really can't remember. I think Ron came up with the first one. And I came up with the second one. And I think the third one was editorially driven because it included the Flash. I think that was editorially driven. But I don't really remember much of the plot of the first one. But I believe Ron and editor Kevin Dooley cooked it up. And then the second one, I really wanted to harken back to the original Denny O'Neil, Neil Adams run, largely to have some fun with it. And my premise was that I don't think it was the whole story, but it was part of the story where Kyle and Connor returned to Desolation, which was a story in the Denny O'Neil, Neil Adams run, in which a town was put upon by, industrial. It was like a love canal kind of story where the people of the town were being poisoned by chemicals and everything else, and the evil corporate overlords were oppressing them and, yada, yada, yada. And I wanted to go back there and sort of, tweak Denny just for fun. And so in the story, Connor and Kyle would go to Desolation, and they find it's not the place they expected to find. This formerly, toxic environment had been cleaned up by the EPA, and everyone in town had sued the chemical company that was poisoning them. And so it was a town of millionaires, and they were all driving big cars, and there were, every strip mall was a mini rodeo drive, and everybody had cash. They were like hillbilly lottery winners. And so that was fun. That was fun to go back and do that and show what would probably have been a logical progression after the O'Neil Adams story. So, but yeah, it was a team effort. It was a group effort. I famously talked about one where an editor tried to drive the story, and I resisted his idiotic ideas. That editor was not Darren Vincenzo, my Green Arrow editor, who was darn awesome guy. But that was Kevin Dooley. Kevin Dooley was pushing for a whole gay thing, and I said no. And I refused to do it, and we didn't, because I refused. And they didn't have the cojones to fire me. A few years later, it would have been a different story. I would have been probably hounded out of the building, chased out onto to 7th Avenue, chased right back to the train by a howling mob of pink-haired weirdos. Anyway, but that wasn't a thing in 1998. Okay, Tim Adams. Hey Chuck, I recently listened to an old Frank Miller interview. I'm reading that as old Frank Miller. I recently listened to an old Frank Miller interview, which he ended with, I came into comics to make them more cinematic. I stay in to make them less so. Sadly, he did not expand on that in the interview, but I was curious what your thoughts would be on this. What do you consider to be more or less cinematic? Should comics avoid trying to be cinematic? What lengths do comics have? What strengths do comics have as a medium that movies don't? Well, I agree with Frank Miller on this. My entire career is a reaction to, comics of the 1970s. I mean, they were as uncinematic as you could possibly get. And a number of Marvel editors, particularly at Marvel, and and then they were also at DC because it was a revolving door between the two companies. So you had the same basically gang of guys editing the books, and they all had the same idea that comics aren't cinematographic. They're not related to movies. They actively in interviews to talk about how they didn't want comics. They didn't want their artists thinking in terms of cinema. They would just think in terms of comics. In other words, just draw what I write. Draw what I tell you to write. And a lot of these writers had no idea about art, or they didn't see the pages as they were doing them. They crowded them with unnecessary exposition. There's really, really frustrating examples where, of particularly 70s Marvel comics, where you're reading it and you realize the artist had a certain intent. He was emphasizing certain things within the panel. He was trying his damnedest to tell the story based on the writer's probably 2-paragraph description, or even, get called on the phone. Hey, what if, the Avengers meet, a flying octopus, and then the artist has to do everything else. And you can see the artist trying to do things, and the writer didn't even see it, didn't understand it, and they're working against the artist in the story. I mean, comics are a visual medium, and they are connected to cinema. They are cinematic. Now on to, basically, let's talk about Frank Miller specifically. I think Miller was just being cute. I mean, that doesn't make any sense. I want to make them more cinematic, and now I'm trying to make them less so. He obviously, you look at his career, you look at his work, he never tried to make them less cinematic. If anything, he leaned harder into it. I mean, 300 is practically storyboards. It's breaking so many of the comic book conventions. And when he talks about cinematic, I mean, we have to go back to his sort of mentor, Will Eisner, or who he acknowledges as his mentor, Will Eisner, and Miller sort of attached himself to Eisner in Eisner's later years. And, when Miller was working particularly on Daredevil, he was breaking a lot of Jim Shooter's rules about storytelling. I don't think Shooter appreciated necessarily a cinematographic approach to comics. The only guy at the time I knew at Marvel who was talking about the relationship between comics and movies was Carl Potts. And if you went to work for Carl Potts, he gave you this Xerox of this book called The 5 C's of Cinematography, and basically broke down how to block out scenes, how to frame images, everything else. Basically, it taught you the language of film. I didn't need to read it, but a lot of artists did. And he would instruct them, because once upon a time editors would teach you things that they knew. They would try to bring you along. If you were just beginning in the business, you sort of went to school with these editors. And at that time, these editors actually knew stuff. They weren't simply trafficking the work. They were actually contributing creatively to the work, because they knew what they were talking about. They could do the job they were asking you to do. So the cinematographic approach. I mean, Will Eisner, a big proponent of it in the 1940s with The Spirit. A lot of those stories read very much influenced by the movies of the time, and sequential pages without words. All the rules of how to block out and frame a movie scene are transported to the page here. And, and comics are a sequential art. There's no arguing against that. Even in the earliest comics, if you look at Little Nemo, which is pure comics. Little Nemo in Slumberland is pure comics, but it's using cinematographic techniques. In a lot of cases, cinematographic techniques that weren't even cinematographic yet, because Little Nemo is basically during World War I, and the language of film is being developed alongside the language of comics, and Winsor McCay with Little Nemo, he's a bit ahead of the curve. He's doing stuff that the movies haven't quite caught up with. So so there is a real relationship here. Now, another obvious influence, had to be an influence on Miller, but I've never heard him acknowledge it, would be Harvey Kurtzman. Harvey Kurtzman, most famously the creator of Mad magazine, was a huge proponent of comics being movies on paper. And he was a master storyteller. And, he did the books that he worked on, particularly at EC Comics, and Mad, Frontline Combat, Two-Fisted Tales. He did the layouts for all the artists. When he wrote the script, he provided layouts as well, and they had to follow them. And he was really pushing where the horror comics at EC were more traditional comics. They're basically just stories, illustrated stories, which most comics were at the time. Kurtzman was going for something more kinetic, more in your face, comics that move, that seem to have a life of their own on the page, than the others were going for. And Kurtzman had to be an influence on Miller. He was certainly an influence on me, as was Eisner. But I think, he had to see these comics, and they had to make an impact on him. But I think Miller's biggest influence, and I've never heard him acknowledge this. I have to say I haven't read every Frank Miller interview, but I think his biggest influence was Joe Kubert. If you look at his Daredevil run, it's Kubert. The storytelling is pure Kubert, and Joe Kubert was very much about telling comics in a cinematographic way, paying attention to the rules of movie making. Progressive action, his use of close-ups, the way he would block and frame scenes, and the way he would use the art to evoke emotions and things like that. And I really think he was Miller's biggest influence, because when I was reading Daredevil, I'm like, there's something familiar about this progression of panels, or the way he did this, or the way he did that. And I realized, I've seen this before. I saw it in a Sergeant Rock story, or a Fire Hare story, or a Tarzan story. I saw this same approach. Not to say that he lifted or stole or swiped any of it, but certainly heavily influenced by Kubert, more so than by Eisner, and more so than by Kurtzman, who, off the top of my head, those are the three biggies. I mean, you got guys like Bernie Krigstein and other guys who would experiment a lot with comic book storytelling. But I really think that Miller's, Miller saw a lot of Kubert growing up. Of course he did. Kubert was everywhere, and Eisner wasn't. You had to seek Eisner out. I'm absolutely certain. Miller's, I think, a little older than me, but he would have seen a lot of Kubert stuff when he was a kid reading comics. And what advantage do comics have over movies? Coolness factor. You can make characters seem so badass in a comic. Picture Wolverine in X-Men, that sewer sequence, and almost any scene of Batman, showing up. There's like this coolness factor that the movies kind of capture, but not quite. I mean, the first two Spider-Man movies, I think, are the best example of, they kind of capture that coolness feel of Spider-Man on screen. But you've got to work at that and understand it, and you can't go too far in a movie with it. Comics let you go pretty far with this stuff, with the highfalutin, stilted language and things like that, and the ta-da moments, or the big moments. In a movie, you're pushing it. You don't want to draw too much attention to it. For an example, is it Avengers Endgame, where it's all the chicks, all the super chicks together fighting? it was cringeworthy watching it as a movie. As a comic book, it would have been awesome. You see what I mean here? As a comic book, you would have gone, yeah, that's really cool. All of the girl characters together, beating up on the bad guys. That's really awesome. In a movie, it seemed forced and contrived. You can get away with murder in comics, particularly superhero comics, with this stuff. And also, it's fan service. We want these characters to look badass and cool. And we're looking for that kind of thing in a comic book. I mean, you want Superman triumphant. You want to see this stuff. And it's harder to translate to the screen. That, yaha. That moment where all the characters are sort of posing, looking cool. Well, it works in a comic. In a movie, it just seems stupid. Which is why I think when they try to replicate it, particularly in Marvel's phases 2 and 3, or whatever phase they're on now, when they try to replicate it, they can't help but make fun of it at the same time. Because, it is kind of silly. But in a comic book, it doesn't seem silly. In a movie, it does. I hope I've made myself clear here. But I think that's the biggest advantage comics have. They can really make those iconic moments huge. As Larry Hama says, make them grand opera. And that just doesn't work. Maybe they should make comic book operas. I'd pay to see one of them. Kieran Brunkert, how do you be versatile? You're different. Wait a minute, hold on. Kieran, you should check here. Actually, I should check these before I go. Anyway, you're different from superheroes to SpongeBob to G.I. Joe to Alpha Core. Are there any genres you haven't explored yet you'd like to tackle? I've never been a comic book specialist, which I think is why I'm still around. I never just wrote superheroes. I never wrote just horror. I love the medium. I like the characters. And I dig it when I get to write characters that I loved as a kid. That's fun. But as much as I love the character, I love the medium more. I mean, I read all kinds of comics when I was a kid, and I wanted to write all kinds of comics. And translating things into the language of comics, I get this huge kick out of it. I mean, that is like the whole reason I do this stuff. I mean, in recent years, I've taken movie treatments and converted them into comics, and it's like this challenge. How do I move this from one language to another? And I just love everything about it. I love the raw energy, the creation, the way comics are created. It's you come up with an idea, and you got a piece of paper, and you got a pencil. You can make a comic book. You can't make a movie. You can't make a song. You can't record a song that way. There's all these other things involved, but it's like you sitting alone at the kitchen table. You can make your own comic book, and I like that raw energy. I like that. Everything about that works for me, and so it doesn't matter what genre. You want to. Obviously, I've got to like the property. I mean, I had to be conversant and like The Simpsons. I had to be conversant with SpongeBob. Chris Duffy, the editor on SpongeBob, was stunned by how much I knew about SpongeBob. But I had kids who were just the right age, and I'd seen like every episode, some of them multiple times. And being a writer, thought about it. Well, what's this world about? Because it is the world of SpongeBob is fascinating because it's completely absurd. But the absurdities have a continuity to them. They have a consistency to them. There are rules. And watching it with the kids and trying to figure out these rules. I mean, they have a campfire at the floor of the ocean. They're at camp and there's a campfire. Okay, that rule's out the window. And then working with Chris Duffy, it's really weird, but SpongeBob was one of my most satisfying creative experiences because I got to talk a lot with Chris Duffy, who really cared about SpongeBob, who, once upon a time editors cared. Who wanted to do the best stories we could, and he understood the property. And we had lots of discussions about what was possible and what was not possible within the world of SpongeBob. And it just made it more fun, So we're doing comics, we're putting on a show. And any genre you want to throw at me. I'm doing a supernatural pirate story now. I mean... I've done pirates, I've done supernatural, never done them together. And that's, to me, that's the treat. I mean, I'd love to do romance. I started a gothic romance comic at CrossGen just before we folded, and wrote a couple of issues of that and had a lot of fun doing it. So I think that's really the only genre that I haven't really explored. I mean, I've done horror, sci-fi, superheroes, westerns, war, SpongeBob, Simpsons, parody, all that stuff. I've done all that. So I think romance is really the only. Now you're going to go, well, there's steampunk, and there's a lot of subgenres and stuff that don't interest me. But romance, that would be a challenge, which is what I look forward to doing this stuff, is the challenge. So before we go on, if you have questions, comments, whatever, something you're curious about, contact me at brunobookstore@gmail.com, brunobookstore@gmail.com, and there is more. I have more to say, but before I go on, if you want to support me, I don't monetize these videos here on YouTube, but you can go to Subscribestar, become a $1 subscriber or a $5 subscriber, and each month you'll get digital goodies, sometimes physical goodies, and you'll also get news at Subscribestar Chuck Dixon that you won't get anywhere else. Follow the link below for that. Now, Joshua Ignatowski makes his, his usual appearance. And he says, when world building, power struggles, and espionage for a fictional setting, what would you say determines the difference between filling your world with compelling intrigue and losing your readers with made-up political issues and elites in outer space that are too abstract for the audience to follow or care? In other words, what separates your Star Wars prequels from your Vinland sagas? Well, the problem with the Star Wars prequels, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about Star Wars later on, but the problem with the Star Wars prequels is that they're basically like interstellar politics. What's at stake? What are we fighting about? What does the Republic represent? And what do they want? What does the Sith want? What does the different trading conglomerates want? And it's all discussed and talked about, but we never see anything. Newt Gunray and whatever consortium he belongs to, they don't want to be taxed. They want lower taxes or no tariffs or something, whatever. Basically, they're free trade advocates. They're supply side economics guys, which of course makes them villains because they're for free trade. George Lucas cleverly names one of them Newt Gunray. Figure that one out. Little slap at I guess right-wing politicians he didn't like, but we never see what the stakes are. Why? What are their interests here? What are they trading? Why do they want free trade? What's their home planet like? As far as we know, Newt Gunray's planet is in desperate straits and really needs to see some high profit margins on what they're trading in order to feed his people. We don't know because we never see any of this. It's all just talked about. Yak. I want this. I want that. Even down to why does the Sith want to run everything? I mean, can't Palpatine just run things through a shadow government? Why does he need all of this nonsense? And and stuff talked about the Jedi, talk about what their goals are, which are all sort of feathery and So basically, what you're seeing, I mean, it's like when they talk about we're being oppressed by the Empire. What form does that take? What form does being oppressed by the on Tatooine? Everything seems kind of, like a hippie commune. I mean, everybody seems to be doing what they're doing, and nobody's doing real well because you're living on a freaking desert planet. There doesn't seem to be a whole lot of natural resources, so you're living the way you're living in these little village environments, And it seems to be a whole lot of criminality going on out in the open. It's certainly a multicultural climate on Tatooine. So how are they being oppressed? They don't seem to be oppressed at all until Leia steals a robot, and then the trouble starts. So a lot of this isn't explained. Why? Okay, well, I understand the bad guys are the bad guys because they're willing to kill ruthlessly, but so are the Jedi. I don't see the Jedi weeping any tears over the people that they cut in half with all their lightsabers. Even though most of them are largely robots in the prequel. So yeah, it's all a lot of who cares. What's at stake. What the characters want doesn't seem clear. What the characters wanted in the original trilogy, it's pretty clear. Luke wants, he's the farm boy, wants to go make good. Darth wants to have his son in the family business. Princess Leia is, she's an activist, and she's trying to protect the interests of her family on Alderaan. And then, when Alderaan gets blown up, she's got a whole different set of desires. And then Han's main desire is just to be near Leia. So it's very clear what's going on there. But you get to the prequels, and it all seems to be a mess. And a lot of tell, don't show. So now you compare it to Vinland Saga, which is a manga, even though I'm using anime imagery here. I've never seen the anime. It's a manga about Vikings. And there are a lot of politics in it. There's a lot of things about trade and oppression and the different clans that have, warring over settlements, over land, over resources and things like that. But the difference between Vinland Saga and the Star Wars prequels is we actually see the results. We see that if this trade doesn't go through, if this ship departs and with its goods and doesn't return, a village will starve. If there's a harsh winter and the crops don't grow, the village will starve. If war happens, innocent people are going to die. They're either going to die as the direct result of war, or they're going to starve, or become ill, or freeze to death, or whatever. So there's real stakes, and the creators of this manga go to great pains to show you the tremendously hard work of creating settlements, of clearing land for farms, being a slave. They show you these things so that it's even more heartbreaking when you see all of that destroyed by the constant warfare between the different Viking clans and factions. So it's a huge difference. The politics here are real. The politics are in your face. The consequences of the actions of the characters are real and affect people. I mean, the manga shows you an extraordinarily cruel world, and cruel in so many different ways. Where it's heartbreaking scenes where you see where people have developed a village and they're happy and they're farming and they're doing well and they're fishing and everybody has a job and it's all very family based and kids and generational wealth is being built, and then 3 dragon ships full of psychotic homicidal maniacs show up and it's all destroyed, and it's heartbreaking. And this was real history. This is the kind of stuff that was going on. It was not a fun time to live in, and it's just a world of difference between that and what Lucas created. There's more heart here. There's more higher stakes, both emotionally and physically. And it's overall a much better story. If you haven't read Vinland Sagas, I suggest you do. I think it's up to its 13th volume. I was reading some recently, just absolutely blown away by what is accomplished in this manga. Okay, there was some talk about sequels. I was talking about sequels and questions about sequels, and I had another thought on what makes a good sequel, or what makes a sequel necessary. And we're going to go back to Star Wars. Star Wars, 1977, explodes on the screen. It's kind of retro feel to it. It's kind of like an old Hollywood movie. It's a yo-ho adventure story. It's kind of light entertainment. It's not heavy, or heavy things happen in it. Bad things happen in it. But it's a sci-fi fantasy. It's a space opera, so you're kind of like enjoying it. And there's humor, and it's just really well crafted popcorn, fun entertainment. And it blew everybody away, and it became huge because it followed the old Hollywood model. Throughout the 1970s, you had these, dour, I love 70s movies, but throughout the 1970s, you had this dour, Taxi Driver and Chinatown and, downbeat, movies trying to be realistic and tell you something about real life and all the rest of it. And here comes Star Wars. And in the same year, Smokey and the Bandit. You can't forget Smokey and the Bandit. And here come these two movies that become enormous hits, because it's like, this is what the audience has been hungering for. This is what everybody's been waiting for. Just a good old time at the movies. And that's what Lucas was going for, and that's what, Burt Reynolds and Hal Needham were going for. Just a good old time at the movies. Just, silly Hollywood craziness. And everybody dug it, and both these movies made buckets of money. Of course, remember Star Wars, because it was huge. It was huge. Number one by far, but Smokey and the Bandit made a hell of a lot of money. If Star Wars was not released that year, Smokey and the Bandit would have been number one at the box office. And it's obvious, you could say, well, one movie doesn't prove anything, but I think two movies prove something. Two movies that couldn't be any more different from each other than, a space opera and, a hillbilly, car race film. So it's like these films opened up to a blue sky for cinema audiences, and it was great. Okay, and everybody dug it, and that created the kind of sequel that's rare, the kind of sequel that audiences demanded. Why? Because they wanted to spend more time with these characters. Everybody fell in love with these characters, and they wanted to see more of them. They just wanted to spend more time with them, and so Empire comes along, Empire Strikes Back, and it is more of the same. It is, hody-ho adventure. It gets a little bit more serious at the end. We learn more about the Jedi and things like that. But overall, this is just in-your-face, big, good time popcorn entertainment. Just throwing it all out there. Hody-ho adventure, beginning to end. Now, Return of the Jedi comes along, and they go a little too far in the direction of light entertainment. I mean, to me, Return of the Jedi, after the first 20 minutes, it's just silly. It's just stupid. And I don't like it. And from there, it's all downhill. And so, what do we end up now? This dour, depressing, Jedi-filled nonsense. The prequels were not fun. The sequels are not fun. completely lost the hody-ho adventure aspect of the movies, completely got away from the humor, the light entertainment, the swashbuckling. And I blame this primarily on the fact that it concentrated on almost entirely on the Jedi. And the Jedi are just not a fun bunch of people. They're not fun to hang around. When I saw Star Wars, I glommed onto Han and Chewie. I wanted to see Han and Chewie movies. And Empire Strikes Back gave us more Han and Chewie. And Return of the Jedi, not so much. Not so much of that aspect of space pirates and smugglers and we're getting more and more Jedi with each movie. Jedi. And Jedi, they're not fun. These aren't fun characters. They're boring. So, I think these are sequels we didn't want. We don't want to spend more time with these characters. And so they ruined the brand in that way. They made sequels that basically no one's happy with. Because apparently they didn't want us to be happy with them. They just lost sight. And I think, Lucas is just as guilty. I think he lost sight of what made the first two movies so much fun and creatively so successful, where all of the others following it just totally fall short. Hey, Guns of Mars, it's become an international sensation. It's now in French, Italian, and German editions on Kindle. Paperbacks are soon to follow. There will be paperbacks within the next few weeks, I promise. Look for the link here if you want to read it in Francois, Italia, or Deutsche. You can pick up a Kindle and explore Mars. Anyway, that's it for me this week. I want to thank you for all the questions and the likes and the suggestions and all the rest of it. And I will see all of you down the road.